This video we are going to learn about thousandths. Now it kind of connects what you've already learned about tenths and hundredths. Now we're going to add thousandths to what we know. So we're going to look at fractions that are written as thousandths and decimals that are written as thousandths. Here's a place value chart that represents tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. So you notice that it's 3 spaces after the decimal. If we want to write a number like 430 thousandths as a decimal, well, because we're writing about thousandths, we have to include our place value up to our thousandths. So I have to make sure to write 430 like this, and I'll put a 0 in the ones place value because we have no ones. And what we end up with is 0.430. I'm representing my tenths, hundredths, and thousandths, and that's important because we're showing thousandths. Here's another example. If I want to represent 810 thousandths as a decimal, I know I have 0 ones, and I have 810 thousandths, 810. So as a decimal, it's written as 0.810. Here's a little bit of a trickier one for you. 62 thousandths. How would I write that as a decimal? Well, if I write 62 thousandths, that's not right because this number here says 62 hundredths because it goes up to the hundredths place value. Alright, that was my telephone. Don't worry about that thing. So, instead, I have to show 62 thousandths. So I'm going to do it in red here. So I have to have 62 thousandths. The 2 has to be in the thousandths place value because I'm showing thousandths. But in this place, I will put a 0, and same with the 0 and the ones. So 62 thousandths is actually equal to 0.062. We're showing our tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. You ready for another little tricky one? 14 thousandths. Now this is similar to the last one. Because we're showing thousandths, we have to include everything up to the thousandths place value. So I'm going to have 0 tenths, or ones I mean, 0 ones, 0 tenths, 1, 4, like that. So I have 0.014. That's how you show 14 thousandths, because we're including tenths, hundredths, and our thousandths place value. Here's one more tricky one. If you get this, you are a smart cookie or cupcake, whatever you like. 1 thousandths. Well, because we're representing thousandths, we need to represent the 3 place values after the decimal. But I only have 1, so if I put that there, that shows 1/10. That doesn't work. If I put a 1 there, that shows 1/100. That doesn't work. So I have to put a 1 here in the thousandths. And then I fill in these spaces with zeros, and I end up with 0.001. And that is the correct way to do it. Thousandths has 3 place values after the decimal. Tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So I need to show tenths, hundredths, thousandths in my number. This next part of the video is going to explain writing decimals as fractions. So if you have a decimal like this, 0.648, you need to write that as a fraction. Well, because we're showing tenths, hundredths, and thousandths, I know that my denominator will be thousandths in my fraction, and I have 648 thousandths. So I write it like that. What about one like this? 0.036. Well, again, I'm showing tenths, hundredths, thousandths. So I'm showing up to the thousandths in my decimal. So in my denominator of the fraction, I have thousandths, and I have 36 of them altogether. 36 thousandths. Excellent. Here's one more tricky one for you. Maybe it's tricky, maybe not. You're smart cookies and cupcakes. 0.009. How would I write that as a fraction? Well, I can't write 9/10ths because there's a 0 in the tenths place. I can't write 900ths because there's a 0 in the hundredths place. This 9 is in the thousandths place, so I write it as 9 thousandths. This cool graph here, or grid, is a thousandths grid. That is right. There are 1,000 of these little squares in this whole grid. Holy moly, that's a lot. That's what makes it a thousandths grid. So the reason I also know it's a thousandths grid is because this here is 10 by 10, and 10 by 10 is 100, so that's a hundredths grid, and I have one there, and 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 there. I have 10 hundredths grids, which makes this big one a thousandths grid. If I asked you to show me 300 thousandths on this grid, or to shade in 300 thousandths, you would have to shade in 300 of these squares. Now I'm going to do it kind of fast. You'll hopefully go much slower and be much more neat than I am. But I'm essentially shading in 300ths by shading in 300ths grids. So that shows 300 thousandths that I've shaded in. What if I asked you to show me 284 thousandths? Well, I'd start by shading in 200. Of course, I'll try to do it neat. You might be able to do it neater than me, and that's important. You don't want to make a mistake on this. There's 200 and then 84 more. There's 80 and 4. Perfect. So now I have 284 thousandths shaded in. Here's a tricky one. What if I say, show me 4 thousandths? That means out of this whole thousandths grid, you only have to shade in 4 of them. There you go. Done. 4 thousandths. Ready for the last challenge? Here it is. Show me 2 tenths. That's interesting because this is a thousandths grid. So it's tough to shade in tenths. But guess what? If I think of equivalent fractions and I think 2 tenths is equal to how many thousandths? Well, what did I do to get from my tenths to my thousandths? I added 2 zeros. So if I add 2 zeros to 2, I get 200 thousandths. And now I'll shade in 200 squares, or 200ths grids. And that shows 2 tenths, which is the same as 200 thousandths. And I know that because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hundredths grids, and I shaded in 2 out of 10. The next thing we're going to talk about is writing decimals in expanded form. So just to quickly recap, do you remember expanded form? If I had a number like 684, you have to represent each place value. So you'd have 600 plus 80 plus 4. If I had a number like 78, you would show 70 plus 8 because you're representing each place value. Now when you get a decimal, it's the same idea. So we're going to start with 1.4. To write this in expanded form, you have to represent each place value. So this number represents 1 because it's in the ones place value. And this number is in the tenths place value, so it represents 0.4 because it's in the tenths place value. So there I'm representing each place value. Here's another example. If I had 1.42, well, no, there's my phone again. I would show this like this. I have 1 in the ones, plus this 4 is in the tenths, so I'm going to show it by going 0.4, plus this 2 is in the hundredths, so I'm going to show that by writing 0.02, because this is the tenths, this is the hundredths, and I have to represent the 2 in the hundredths. Let's do a couple more examples. If I have this number, 1.046, well, the 1 represents 1, plus this 0 represents 0, so I don't even have to write anything in for it. This 4 represents hundredths, so I have to write 0.04 to represent the hundredths place value, plus this 6 represents the thousandths place value, so I write 0.006. This is the last example, I promise. Here's a number to represent in expanded form, 0.082. Well, there's no ones, so I don't have to represent that. There's no tenths. There's an 8 in the hundredths, so I'm going to start by writing 0.08 because I'm representing this 8 in the hundredths place value, tenths, hundredths. Plus, there's a 2, there's my phone again. There's a 2 in the thousandths, so I'm going to write that as 0.002. And this is my answer for writing the number in expanded form.